Hi, this is Simon Upstill and welcome to another tutorial for Apple Motion. And today I want to introduce you to one of the most important and versatile compositing techniques of all, and that's the technique I like to call blur scaling for reasons that will become apparent. So first we're going to dive into the science of it, and we're going to get a really good understanding of how blur actually works from a scientific point of view, and then we'll be looking at all the different ways in which this technique can be used. So let's get started. So to start off with, I want us to consider what actually is happening when we create a blur. Now, the simplest kind of blur is called a box blur, and that's where every pixel is averaged against the pixels that are nearest to it, and the blur radius determines how many of those nearest pixels are used for the average. So in this schematic, we're looking at a 5x5 box blur. So it's a matrix of 5x5 pixels, and that's basically the size, the radius of the actual blur. And obviously each pixel has a set of neighboring pixels. So the immediate neighbors are these 3 rows and columns, and out from that we have these 5 rows and columns. And those all get averaged together. So what I've actually done to show you this is I've created a homemade box blur using Motion. And here's my original image, and I've used this kind of crosshatch to try and accentuate it because a 5x5 box blur is not a great deal. So here, if I turn that off, is my homemade blur. And let's look at how it's done. So you'll see that inside this group, there's my original image, and there are 24 clones of it, so 25 images in all. And if we remind ourselves of our matrix, we've got 5x5, so that's obviously 25 pixels that we need to compare. And so that's how we get to this. And so each of these layers is offset according to that matrix. So at the bottom here, I've got a pixel that's offset by 1 pixel on X and down 1 pixel on Y. And the next one is just down 1 pixel on Y. And the next one is 1 pixel to the left on X and 1 pixel down on Y, and so on. And as we get up the matrix, we're using 2 pixels out. So if we looked at this pixel, for example, that would be -2 on X and +1 on Y, and so on. So then what I've done is I've added them all together using the additive blend mode, as you can see here. So that figure of 4%, it's pretty obvious where that is. 100% divided by 25 gives us 4. So there you have it. That's how to build a basic box blur. So that's the original, that's the blurred version. But let's actually look at a conventional blur in action. So I'm in a new project here, and I'm just going to bring in a color solid, and I'm going to make it black. And then I'm going to use the rectangle tool to make a square. That's holding down the shift key to get it to be square. And I'm just going to center it up. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I want the size to be 20 pixels. And let's zoom right into this so we can see. So you probably immediately notice that around this square, there are a couple of lines of grey that's not black or not white. And this is, in fact, the anti-aliasing of this rectangle. So what is anti-aliasing? So we can actually turn it off if we switch to draft mode. And you can see that we've got none of those grey pixels. And if we then try to, for example, rotate this box, you'll see it looks really horrible. Whereas if we come back to normal, you'll see that we've got these grey pixels, and that, if we zoom out a little bit, it just removes that jagginess that we get with this basic anti-aliased version. So anti-aliasing is basically a form of blur, as you can probably guess, because we've got grey values on the edges there. So I'm going to reset that rotation, and let's add to this group a basic Gaussian blur. Now, Gaussian blur is a bit more sophisticated than the box blur that we looked at, but from the point of this demonstration, it doesn't actually make any difference. So what I'm actually going to do is set this amount to 10, and I want you to look what we've now got. We've got a lot more shades of grey. You know, if we discounted that anti-aliasing, we've got shades of grey between the black of the background and the white of the foreground square. And that confirms that basically what we're doing is averaging the values of the neighboring pixels. So you'll notice that currently the center is white, but if I increase the Gaussian blur amount to 20, remember that radius actually relates to pixels. These center pixels, if you look at the numbers up here while I hover, you can see that they're no longer completely white. And as we increase, that becomes ever more grey. And that's because even these center pixels are being averaged with the black pixels on the outside there. So what I'm going to do now is increase that blur amount to 128, and I'm going to zoom out. And you can see that's gone really grey. So first of all, I'm going to do what I normally do, and that's to add a filters, color, and levels. And then I'm going to crush those whites as much as I possibly can. And you can see that all those central grey pixels have now become white. We've still got a little fringe of grey. And interestingly enough, our rectangle has now turned into a circle. So there's our original rectangle. There's our blurred and crushed result. And it's turned into a circle. So that's starting to seem really interesting, isn't it? So I'm actually not going to use levels for most of this. I'm going to come back to levels later on and explain exactly why it's useful. But I'm actually going to use instead filters, color, and threshold. And I'm going to reduce that threshold down to 0.01, and I'm going to reduce the smoothness down to 0. And now something really quite interesting has happened. We've actually got a white circle with no fringing, with no grey fringing at all. And that's what threshold is doing. Basically, anything above the threshold is white, and anything below the threshold is black. And that's why we're getting this result here. You'll notice that smoothness starts to bring in some latitude to that calculation, but I'm going to leave that switched to 0 for the time being. So with these settings, I'm going to increase the size of my rectangle. So I'm going to go up to 250. And you'll notice that with this blur, we've actually got a nice rounded cornered rectangle. So then I'm going to duplicate that rectangle, right-click, duplicate, and then I'm going to move it away from the original. And I want you to look what happens. You get this really interesting kind of sucking effect. And then at some point they separate, but you can see they're kind of glued together. And this is a really nice result that we get from using this method, because obviously we're applying it to the group overall. And the more we increase this blur value, so if we went forward like 256, the more that is going to be exaggerated. So grab that rectangle again and move it, and you can see it looks really nice and sticky. And indeed, I used this in a tutorial on creating cell division, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description because it's quite a nice use of this technique. So then let's look what happens if we adjust that threshold, and you can see that the blobs sort of separate and they just keep shrinking, and they actually shrink down to nothing. So that's a really interesting option as well. We can make things gradually shrink in a very nice organic way using this technique. And what happens if we adjust the blur? So if we adjust the blur, we just get more and more roundness. And that's more or less what I ended up with my cell division. You see, we've got this really nice hourglass effect. So both the blur amount and the threshold are going to determine how this actually looks. So basically this technique is what I call kind of blobifying. You know, we've got kind of gloopy blobs. And I want to actually show you what it looks like if we add in some text. So I'm going to add in the word blur. I've obviously got, my threshold is so high that we're not actually seeing that. I'm going to increase that size to 250, and you can see that we've got something there. And it's just another blob, in fact. But if I turn off my threshold and Gaussian blur, you can see that's our nice clean text. Again, we can adjust that threshold, and that kind of sticks together like that. If we reduce that blur amount progressively, that's a really useful reveal one can do there, where if you just adjust that blur value, we're revealing the text out of these blobs. And I really like that effect. So I'm just going to turn off these rectangles and center up that text and just make it much, much larger so I can show you the next bit. Let's zoom right in so we can see the edges. If I turn up the blur amount, you can see what this is also doing. Just as our rectangle turned into a circle, when we apply it to text, we get this nice rounding effect. Again, you might, in this instance, probably just back off on the threshold like that to get a smoother result. But you can see that, again, that's a really useful thing to be able to do, just to round the corners of text or any other object you want to round the corners of. And I also want to show you, while we're looking at this, how the threshold value allows us to grow or shrink the size of the object. So if I increase that threshold value, you'll notice that my text progressively shrinks. Sort of almost starts to disappear there, but it's actually much smaller there. Conversely, if I reduce the threshold, my text expands. So at a threshold value of 0.5, essentially not a great deal is happening to the text in terms of its overall size. Obviously, we're getting that rounding, but we're not getting any shrinking or expanding. But below 0.5, we're getting expansion, and above 0.5, we're getting shrinking. And the reason for that is that if we make more of the grey values white, we'll get expansion. And if we make more of the grey values black, we'll get shrinkage. And this technique is actually really useful in advanced compositing because it allows you to shrink or expand a matte very, very carefully and smoothly. And it's very widely used in visual effects. So it's a really useful technique from that point of view as well. So as you can see, there are lots of applications to this technique. So finally, I want to point out something about levels. I said I would come back to it. Now, obviously, threshold is working pretty well, and we've got a softness control and everything. So in most respects, it's actually working really nicely. But I'm actually going to turn back on some of these rectangles so I can actually just turn this rectangle on. And I'm just going to increase its size so I can show you what I mean here. So the problem we have is that threshold won't work on the alpha channel. It'll only work on RGB. So to explain what I mean, I'm going to grab those and I'm going to move them onto the text instead of the group. And you can now see that we've got this rather annoying, well, I mean, it might not be annoying, it might be something you want, but we've got this kind of shadowing effect. And that's because the threshold is not actually affecting the alpha channel, it's only affecting the RGB. So as we shrink more and we get more and more of that black, and that's obviously not something that we would normally want unless we actually think we like that effect. So that's why, instead of threshold, when it's a case of there being an alpha channel that we need to shrink, I use levels. And that's because levels allows us to access alpha, and it's here. So instead of RGB, let's access alpha, and then we can use the alpha controls to sharpen up the text. And you can see we don't get that fringing because we're just literally manipulating the alpha there. If you want to be very precise about this, you can open up the histogram and you can come down and, where's alpha? It's called opacity. Don't ask me why Apple decided to call it alpha here and opacity down there. It's pretty daft, I have to say. But if we get this black in value really close to that white in value, we can get a really sharp result. I'm just going to turn off that rectangle so we don't need to see it. So the closer we get those two values together, actually I'm going to increase that Gaussian blur value. Let's go back up to 128 so we can see this properly. So if I go for example, 0.4 on the black in, and 0.401 on the white in, we get a really sharp result like that. In fact, for most purposes, that's much too sharp because we're seeing those jaggies. And obviously, the wider apart those values are, the softer that's going to be. So 0.45 is actually quite a nice, smooth result. So there you go. That's an overview of blur scaling. And although it's quite a simple technique, as you can see, it has lots of interesting uses. So I hope you found that useful. Thanks very much indeed for watching. See you again soon.